Hi, I'm Jake Rudin, and you're watching A Student's Perspective.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today on A Student's Perspective. I am Jen. I'm going to be interviewing Jake Rudin. And if you like this, please comment, share, do what you gotta do. But thank you for joining us. Jake, if you wanted to take a moment and just introduce yourself to our viewers.
Sure, Jen, I'd be happy to do that. First of all, thanks so much for inviting me. It was really nice to hear from you guys and get the opportunity to come on. Hi, Mom. No, but yeah, my name is Jake Rudin. I am the Senior Manager of Digital Technologies at Adidas. So I am in Portland, Oregon. I run a team of computational designers who tackle all kinds of different problems related to footwear and apparel. I, however, am also a ex-architect. So I studied architecture. I have my bachelor's in architecture from Cornell University, and I went on to study and get my master's in design technology from the Harvard GSD. And I decided very early on that, there was something missing between the experience of being in studio and doing all of these things that I loved, and then hitting the floor of a firm and, trying to catch up and feel like I was learning something totally new. And that actually sprung my other venture, which is called Out of Architecture. So I'm the co-founder of a career consulting business. My business partner, Aaron Pellegrino, and I started the company almost 4 years ago. And it has been a really interesting adventure of helping designers and architects to realize the power of their skills in a bunch of different industries outside of traditional practice. So that's a little bit about me.
That's wonderful. I'm pretty excited about this conversation because I think a lot of students are going to find this to be a relatable and very relevant conversation to their current lives, maybe what they think about is going to happen in the future. But before we do dive into all of that, just if you wanted to speak about your college experience, where you went. I know I read into that you went into grad school. So if you just wanted to touch upon your college and background on that.
Sure. I I didn't really know that I wanted to be an architect. I think a lot of architectural students come in with a story of like, I loved Legos. I was really into, sketching buildings and design. And I was just always someone who enjoyed making things. My father and I built a guitar together when I was in high school. I always enjoyed sort of being outside. I thought maybe at one point I would be a landscaper. And I actually sort of found architecture through this very sort of strange happenstance of, oh, maybe I'll be a landscaper. Oh, there's a thing called a landscape architect. I wonder what an architect really does. And to this day, I still think like, I wonder what an architect really does. But I discovered this, and I've always been a sort of type A personality. I thought, well, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to go to the best place for it. So I Googled, what is the best architecture school, and so Cornell University came up for undergrad, and I went for a 9-week summer college program, and I just immediately was hooked. I mean, it was everything that I never knew I wanted to do all in one go. So drawing, I loved building models. I loved the idea that the way that we look at things can be based on like the method of manufacturing. It can be based on like trying to read into someone else's intention. So I went into school and I wouldn't trade that experience for anything. I spent 5 years at Cornell, and in that time, I spent a disturbingly large amount of time in the model shop. I loved learning how to do 3D fabrication, laser cutting, CNC milling, all of these things. In fact, for my thesis, I built a like 1/12 scale model of a massive tree. My thesis was a tree house. And so I kind of explored all corners of architectural design. One of the things that I was sort of innately good at was 3D modeling and computational design. I really was not ever the person in studio who had like the best concept. I was always the person who could like take a moderately interesting concept and sort of like make it whimsical through my drawings or my model making or things like that. So I really leaned on those skills. When I started to think about leaving school, when I started to think about graduating, I had already had enough internship experiences where I was like, I don't know that this is 100% what I wanted to do, but I knew that I had a passion for architecture with a capital A, of like this amazing holistic design profession. And so I decided to go forward and get my master's, not for more professional pathway, but really to allow me to go farther into academia. At that time, I thought like, I'm going to go teach, like I know this environment is something I love. I love being in this education system. And that's kind of what pushed me to spend the extra years and money on a graduate degree. And I think it was a fantastic experience. I spent a lot more time in technology, in robotics and coding, and in VR and Unity and stuff like that. So it was a very diverse set of experiences through school. And there's another story to be had there then of like, what do you do with all of those experiences? Like, how do you sell yourself as this person who's like, I'm not an expert in any one thing, but I just crave newness. I love to learn new things. Um, so that was an interesting experience. That was kind of my collegiate experience in a nutshell.
That's really interesting. All of the layers to your path and journey of where you ended up now. I can definitely relate. I did not know I wanted to be. I'm actually studying interior architecture, but regardless, it's kind of a
Hmm.
meshed program here. But yeah, I didn't know I wanted to be here. And then stepping into the program, it's a really interesting aspect that they kind of have to step you out of your comfort zone and you have to think very outside the box and almost learn how to think and go about thinking in that way. So I definitely relate to that. That's really interesting. And grad school wise, I would also probably like to go and move forward. I've been thinking about it almost in the aspect of just I want to be able to go out and teach. I love the education system as well. So that's really all very interesting. And I'm wondering now, because you mentioned being good at the digital fabrication and just all of that sort of creativity, is that what landed you the position you are in with Adidas now? And maybe if you wanted to even explain what role you play in the company there?
Yeah, for sure. Um, Before I do that explanation, I think it's really interesting to hear kind of your current thought process on like, all right, I'm in this degree now. I'm not sure necessarily like where I want to be moving forward. Maybe I need to go and like get this sort of graduate degree. And I get asked this question of like, would I go back and do it again? And I think the answer is yes, but I would have a very different thought process around why I was going back. And kind of this idea that maybe like honing in and getting even more and more specific, which is what a lot of people think they need to do, isn't necessarily the best thing that you can do for yourself. I think having these like various experiences and going into a program where you're you're giving yourself like multiple options is so important. And it's really exciting to hear that you're thinking about that. Sometime we should spend some more time talking about, what grad school means. Is it worth the money?
I would
Are you,
love to do. Absolutely.
yeah,
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 definitely in a position of being in senior year right now, and the gates are wide open to where I want to go and what I kind of want to enter. And I'm really not too far from Scranton myself. I live about 40 minutes from here, so I do reside here, but I've not gone further than this. So it's a pretty scary thought to kind of think about where can my next steps be. I could stay here. I could book it to Europe. I could literally do anything with that option. So yeah, I would love to definitely have a conversation on that someday.
yeah. So as far as what I do and my transition to Adidas, it was a very windy, long pathway that is not in any way a straight line. Um, I think one of the things I always tell clients is, you can tell your story in a way that makes really logical, linear sense, but no matter how good you get at that, like there's always the truth behind it, which is we never really know where we're going to end up. Like everyone who is applying for jobs, everyone who is applying to schools, who is going on these different pathways, you're sort of at the behest of like who wants to bring you on board, like who feels like they vibe with you and they want you in their life. And sometimes that's a school or a company or a manager. And I absolutely felt like my pathway was just about saying yes to so many of these opportunities and trying to make the most of them, even if they were for a very short period of time. Landing at Adidas, I did by way of when I graduated graduate school. I went to work for a startup in Boston. It was a startup run by an architect, but it was a VR education technology startup. I had met this person because my wife was also working for his architecture firm at the time.
Okay.
And we had this long conversation about, how technology can kind of change the world and what it means to be an architect, but how you can also design interactions and spaces for people to do all kinds of things, including to learn. I then ended up spending 2 years there in business development. Not something I thought I would ever be doing, but surprisingly took a lot of the skills from architecture school,
Okay.
a lot of stakeholder management, pitching concepts, creating beautiful graphics for a pitch deck. This was a very interesting experience. And the reason that I ended up leaving that company was we moved out here to be closer to family. So moved from Boston to Portland. And when I made that move, I had at that time had the fortune of helping a few friends kind of navigate into other industries. This was like pre any kind of formation of out of architecture as a business. And at the time, I thought, this is a good opportunity for me to explore. I had taught game design in Boston at Northeastern. I had all of these various experiences. So I applied to any company that I thought had an interesting position of any sort. I mean, I applied to game design roles, furniture building, architecture firms, just pretty much anything you can name. And there is also a huge presence out here of sports companies. And so there's Nike, Adidas, Under Armour, Lululemon, Keen, Columbia. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And so I
Right.
thought, okay, well, this is probably a good place to look as well. Seemed like there were some cool jobs. And I interviewed at Adidas for a role that was called a technical manager position. And the only thing I knew about the job at the time was that it had Rhino as one of the key softwares in the
Right.
description, which I was like, I'm really good at this. Um, it turned out to be that this position is pretty much a studio role. And it really was, well, how can you kind of learn quickly about new technologies? How can you implement these technologies either via manufacturing or via kind of a digital lens? how can we build virtual models of the shoes that we're making? What does it mean when you take a shoe that's already built and kind of unwrap it, or sort of create an exploded view of it to sort of digest it? And I thought, oh my gosh, we do that with buildings all the time. So
Yeah.
I super excitedly got my portfolio out and I started showing like my plaster cast models and like trying to equate this to what was being described to me in footwear, which is, of course, you make really heavy steel molds by which you kind of press these composite foams to create, the base, the midsole of the shoe. And I started just like having all of these amazing connections, and I was really fortunate to get that opportunity. It was not something I knew existed. It was not a position I ever planned on taking. And I've now been here for almost 5 years, and I run a team of 8 people who run the gamut from kind of textile and fabrication to very digital focused, kind of Rhino Grasshopper designers, and even into like a very sort of engineering focused computational finite element analysis. So it's a really broad spectrum. And I think it has been enabled only by my really weird architectural education that spanned all of these different topics. So
Yeah, it's crazy to see just the links. There's a cobweb of never ending linkages between what
mhm.
you learned in architecture school and how you can apply it to honestly some of the most unique topics. So it's really interesting that now you're in the company of Adidas when you went to school for architecture, but just everything you were able to experience and learn while going through architecture school and just the things you experience after that. It's really nice to see that there is just honestly, again, endless opportunities for you because now you are in this amazing position. And you mentioned that you did teach game design. Where did you do that at? And if you honestly want to elaborate a little bit on that, because that's pretty cool too. Because again, it's not exactly architecture, but it's still in the design world. And I think that can
Sure.
a lot of interest.
So I mentioned that, I said yes to a lot of things that, maybe would not have seemed like the right sort of focused move for a lot of people in their career. I think especially as, an architect coming out of the like top 2 architecture schools in the nation, it was like all of my colleagues and friends were going to these huge firms that were just, hiring in mass from these schools. And I was kind of at this conference showcasing a game project that I had worked on for this landscape course. It was called Immersive Landscapes. And someone from Northeastern University, they have a college called CAMD, which is the one that does both, I think, architecture design. They do game design, some other kinds of media. And she showed up, and we were having this discussion about like using Unity, like the way in which I thought code was super interesting, but that I had really didn't have that great an understanding of how to code. And she said, I really like your work. Do you think you could learn how to code well enough to teach this like basic game design class in Unity that we're offering? And I was like, yeah, of course. And in the back of my head, I was like, what are you saying? Like, there's no way. I had always been like the worst coder, the worst kind of developer in any class that I was in. We had lots of like introduction to C# or JavaScript. And I had many friends and colleagues who carried our group projects,
Yeah.
through school. And yet I said yes to this opportunity, and I spent, oh my goodness, just weeks and weeks with my head buried in my screen trying to come up with a curriculum of what it would take from someone to go from zero to a full working prototype video game. And I basically recounted that experience in front of a class of about 20 undergraduates at Northeastern. And this was during the time that I was also working for this startup. And it was a fantastic experience. Not only did it make me realize that, you know, your professors are not always the most experienced. Sometimes they're the people with just like the most interesting perspective on the subject. It's not
Okay.
necessarily like the most honed in. And I felt very fortunate to have a set of students who were willing to kind of go with me through this experience of maybe I don't know the best way to do this, but figuring it out together sort of became the lens of the class, where we each had our own individual, let's say, game that we were building. And I had built several at this time, so I didn't feel like I wasn't able to explain the premises, to explain the concepts, but it at the end of the day was just a very, very positive experience that I felt like, looking back on, it made so much sense from the lens of learning how to communicate through games, learning how to code, doing all these technical things. But I didn't retain really any of that technical knowledge. What carried forward for me, and also I know from speaking with the students, for a lot of the students, was the lens of how do I apply problem solving sort of actively in this discipline? And that is something that design, whether it's interior architecture, architecture, you know, teaches you so well. That is what I think we all pay for and go to school for, is the ability to apply these different problem solving techniques and to kind of divorce ourselves from the media or the medium in which we do it.
Yeah, and that I actually took a listen to the podcast you were recently in with Aaron and James Z.
Mhm.
Something that was mentioned was look at your career as a design problem. So that's kind of just ringing in my head right now, mentioning the problem solving. And yeah, again, regardless what aspect of design you are doing, I think no matter where you are in the design world, everyone understands that there's numerous iterations. You're just going to keep on trying and failing and starting over and going over and over again with the design process. And I think being a teacher and knowing how it is to be in the design school definitely probably helped a lot with your students. And I definitely agree. It's really nice to have a bunch of different professors with different backgrounds and understanding of where they ended up or maybe how and what they know and how they approach that. So, yeah, that was honestly really interesting to hear your perspective on the teaching world. So, thank you for explaining all of that. And I do kind of want to now talk about out of architecture because, along with everything in your teaching experience, along with going through all of that, were you and Aaron Pellegrino, your colleague, did you guys know that this was something you wanted to enter? Did you get inspired from teaching, or maybe just all of the different experiences you have gone through? What kind of came about, and how did you get to out of architecture being?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think we've both gone on our own teaching pathways. Aaron still actively teaches both professional practice in architecture as well as architectural studios. And I think teaching was a big component of starting out of architecture, because the interactions that we started to have as mentors and with our students really revealed a lot of the underlying problems, I think, that exist within not just architecture, but a lot of design industries. Architecture is sort of this unresolved area because it deals with the built environment, and it's protected in many ways from the sort of design integration that came through with a lot of tech companies, that came through in a lot of other industries, and brought, let's say, graphic design, UX design out from under a rock and into the limelight. But when we started to have these conversations with students, we really began to see more and more that it wasn't just us, right? It wasn't just like I wanted to necessarily leave architecture, but there was a whole range of people experiencing this disconnect And when I say the disconnect, I mean architecture as a professional practice is very different, and I would say substantially less diverse in the amount of tasks, and in many ways less creative in terms of the resolution than it is in education. And that disconnect really, is exaggerated when you're coming from an institution that highlights the creative nature of what you're doing and that teaches you to value that. So we were having students come to us asking for support in navigating, this transition beyond architecture, outside of the profession. And we really felt, well, there must be a need here. And I think that was one of the reasons early on why Aaron took on the professional practice courses, was to be able to support this generation in understanding not only what true architectural practice would look like, but also how they could use those skills and what the value of those skills were. From my lens, I started to have more and more people reaching out as I made the transition to this big company with, a shiny name and really good visibility. And everyone was saying, how did you manage to land, a job at Adidas with an architecture degree? And I think we're enough years probably down the road that it's a little less shocking. But, back in kind of 2016, 17, when I was making this transition, it felt to me that I was like very alone in making that transition. And I really wanted to support other people in telling them, like, this is absolutely possible. I now know that there are thousands and thousands of people with long storied careers of 10, 15, 20 years who have made this transition. And some of the most famous footwear designers, for example, are former architects. So I don't think, in any ways I was the first person to make this jump, but there is also a very real skill to it. And I think having the moral support, having the backing of someone who has been through it before is really necessary. And I was very lucky to have, a friend who kind of, helped me as if I was, the first out of architecture client. So we sort of joke that we were our own first clients. And so I felt like I wanted to give that back to other people. And for a very long time, we sort of performed that service just as friends and as mentors. And it then grew by word of mouth and sort of became necessary to form it into a business. And now it has become quite a bit larger than I had ever expected. So
I really appreciate the authenticity behind how you became what you are with that company. And if you wanted to touch upon, because you kind of mentioned here and there what it is you guys do, but if you wanted to elaborate specifically what it is that you guys do in order to maybe help these clients and how this amazing business has grown to be what it is and what opportunities maybe you offer everybody.
Absolutely. So the core business is career consulting and coaching. And that's really a one-on-one service that we provide where we meet people. Usually they come to us either by Googling out of architecture or finding us on social media or by word of mouth. And we have a conversation with them. And it really just starts there, that where are you in your search? Like, where are you in your career? What are you thinking about? What brought you to essentially to ask this question, like, how do I leave the traditional path that I was on? So the ways in which we help clients, typically it's pretty one-on-one, and it really depends where the client is in their search. So they could be at the very beginning, wondering what industry they want to go into, asking us questions like, maybe this is the thing I loved most in studio. Maybe it was about rendering and visualization. How can I use those skills beyond architecture? And we might outline then, well, you could go into the gaming industry, you could go and work in film and media, you can also go to an architectural visualization company. Those are some of the early stages, but we also help with application materials whether it's resume, portfolio. Sometimes we just help to demystify the hiring process. It can be really different applying to a really big company or even any company outside of architecture, engineering, and construction when you have all these assumptions from your career and school that, oh, all I have to do is talk about, my Revit skills or my ability to put together a material board or, my ability to do a layout. Those are things that not everyone has the same context to. So I think we help people to tell that story. And then even beyond there, there's a very real question mark for a lot of people is what is my value outside of my title? So we help with salary negotiation. We help people to find roles that are actually appropriate to their experience. Sometimes it's that they have more experience than they actually think. And sometimes it's that they're applying to roles that simply, they just don't understand the titles for. And so trying to clarify that pathway and just help people to have a smoother transition than maybe they would have by themselves.
I really appreciate the background and everything that you have done in this business. And I almost want to ask, is there a general theme that people come to you for? Maybe there's usually one main thing that they're asking, or is it just in general getting out of that studio mindset and entering what it is like in the actual professional world?
And I think people actually want to go into the studio mindset. They want to go back
Yeah.
into like, this is what I loved in school.
Mhm.
I think no, there is no one theme. We've had clients who are still in school 2 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out. Maybe they've been in the practice 15 years and they're just feeling really burnt out. Maybe it's about money. Maybe it's also about just appreciation. Sometimes we have clients coming to us. We've had clients that have run their own firms for 25 years who have, you know, just are looking to take their skills into maybe consulting or into a corporate setting. I think there's no one pathway, which is why we really have this, we have this service as a completely unique one-on-one offering. But there are some themes, especially early on in young careers. And we've been trying to do some more group career workshops that are at a much lower price point and also that are trying to be made available to people who just have these general questions of like, can I take my degree and go do something else without going to get a master's? Can I, safely say that this counts as experience? Or what do I do if someone proposes this to me? How can I respond? What's a polite way to leave one job for one that you think is better, right? There are so many early career experiences, I think, that we come across that have very clear answers, but that are so, hidden in mysticism because no one wants to talk about it, right? Like it feels like it's this very solitary personal experience, and that the reality is it's not. Everyone goes through that kind of stuff, and it really is something that I think we can support each other on as a design community, and in fact raise all of our values together rather than just sort of keeping quiet and feeling like, well, it's inappropriate to talk about, that maybe one firm really is not doing a good job supporting its staff, and this other firm treats everyone really well. The more that we kind of raise our expectations and communicate, the better that we can present ourselves as a community of designers.
I absolutely agree. And I think being a student still, I hear a lot, and I know a lot of my peers hear a lot that once you leave school, you should know that you're not going to be getting your dream job. You're not going to land exactly what you want to. And you have to go through all of these nooks and crannies and kind of do the things that you don't necessarily want to do and you almost settle. But in your podcast, you mentioned that no, you don't have to necessarily just push your dreams aside and settle for the things that you have to get through in order to do what you really want to do. So I think that's a wonderful aspect to kind of help people find it is what exactly it is that they want to do and maybe send them on a path that gets them maybe closer or exactly where they do want to end up. So I think this entire business is a very wonderful thing. And a lot of people listening right now maybe might even look into it because it might be ringing perfectly to what they need to hear and where they need to go in order to find out where they want to go next. And I want to ask now about, you were a student once, and like you said previously, you have no idea where you're going to end up. Anything can happen. You can land a job anywhere. Would you, when you were a student, did you ever think of yourself as being in a position of being in charge? Because you lead a team at Adidas, you also are the entire creator of this out of architecture business. Did you ever think of yourself as a leader in that way, or did you surprise yourself? Is it
Mhm.
stressful?
Yeah, so being a co-founder and being a people manager are very different forms of leadership, but they both are really exciting and stressful in their own ways. So being a co-founder is like being your own manager and also having to like manage just an entire ecosystem is very much like a studio project. Like, what's the branding like? What are the hours going to be? How do we get people to be excited about this and yet preserve the values that we have and the mission? If we go this way, does it fit into the theme or the party of the rest of our design? So that I felt like I had done before. That felt like studio. Being a people manager is not something I think that architects are well prepared for in studio. I also don't think that most young graduates are necessarily going to be experienced at that. It takes a lot of years of just going through, how to handle various situations, being open to conversation, trying to read what someone is maybe not saying, and trying to figure out the best way to interact with somebody. But I did feel like teaching provided me with that experience and in droves. And certainly having been a teaching assistant early on felt like not being in charge so much. I still don't really ever feel in charge. There will always be, even if you own the company, there are shareholders or people who are invested in the outcome. Maybe it's your clients, right? And you feel like, okay, well, I'm not in charge because it's whatever the client wants. But people management, I think I did have that experience. And as I was saying, being a teaching assistant, even when I was in school, really helped me to understand like, how do I translate what I know to be true to someone else? Like, how do I provide them with the same framework to make decisions so that A, I don't have to make decisions for them. I can trust them to make their own. And B, so that they can actually balance you. And maybe what you think to be true is not. And so they can come back and say, well, I appreciate your honesty. I think you're wrong. Here is how I would go about this. And I'm really lucky to have a team at Adidas, both my my leaders, my boss, as well as my direct reports, who feel comfortable providing that feedback. So I think the only other thing that I can say is having been in studio critiques every week and getting feedback and being open to it and learning not to take it personally,
Yes,
that's
definitely.
probably the greatest skill that any designer can have, is to sort of separate yourself from the feedback on whatever it is, your work, right? And sometimes your work is managing people, and the feedback can feel really personal. It's like, oh, you didn't say that to me well, or you made me feel this way.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to step back and say, okay, instead of being defensive, what would be the best mechanism then for me to communicate that to you? Or what would be, the right outcome? And I think doing right by people is probably the hardest and most important thing to do over the course of your career. Um, if there's anything I've learned, especially in out of architecture, it's the people that we sort of help along the way, they become your biggest allies, and they really make or break your success. So I certainly think that is it was a long way to get here, long road.
Yeah, and as I mentioned previously, just being in this sort of environment and kind of having to reel back and understand that, yeah, you are going to fail and you are going to have to try again and again. So with the criticism, you have to understand that everything is a learning experience. So I find it really interesting that talking to you about your journey and kind of how you ended up to all the different places you have, each thing that you learned in the past has piggybacked and influenced the next thing that you have done. So being in architecture school, you were able to understand game design and be able to go back to the drawing board and teach a whole class of students in how to get to point A to point B. So it's really wonderful to kind of just see how everything is interlinked. And outside of all of your businesses and everything that you do on a day-to-day basis, is there any projects that you are working on outside of this? Maybe you have worked on, whether it be architecture or just a simple hobby, whatever it may be.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't think I have any simple hobbies, but I do have some hobbies. Many of them include just growing things. My wife is, as I mentioned, also an ex-architect. So she worked for a number of years in the profession and has since this year left and started a vineyard business. So we have a sort of side project, which is very much a full-time business, and that has been really a fun endeavor to, again, like have the opportunity to learn about a completely different industry, to learn and see the way in which design interacts with something like labels for wine bottles, or building a tasting room, or curating an experience. So it's been a lot of fun to have this sort of menagerie of plants in the backyard, to be able to sort of go out into the countryside and kind of enjoy this new experience. And I think that as as a hobby, just learning new things and getting like deeply into them has always been really important for me. So right now it's viticulture and plants, but
Thank you for sharing that. There's a
mm,
lot of multi-talents within you. So that's really interesting to learn about that.
yeah,
And
I
it's
don't
really
get to take any credit for this one. So that is that is a plug for my fantastic wife.
That's really interesting too, that you are in a home environment of also being with someone who was previously had gone through all of this, had
Mhm.
went through architecture school, so you guys definitely can relate to each other on that basis. And I really like to hear that it's also another aspect of where she ended up somewhere outside of architecture, but it sounds like she's definitely loving doing what she's doing. And again, going back to just what you learn here in school is going to drastically affect how you look at the world, how maybe you look at one simple thing on the table and how did that come about? How was that
Mhm.
made? And just how everything has a certain process to being where it is. So thank you for sharing that little bit of your life. And before we do go to wrap things up, I just wanted to ask you one final question. If you were to go back and talk to your student self, what is one piece of advice that you would give yourself?
I think the one piece of advice that I would give myself as a student is, don't try so hard to fit the narrow pathway that you think you're supposed to be on. Definitely embrace the variety, embrace the experiences that you might feel like you're innately drawn to, but you can't explain. Spend a lot of time tree climbing and going to strange classes, in other colleges that I just didn't think were going to have an impact. And almost every single one has affected my life in a really positive way, whether it's some small turn or the ability to have some really meaningful conversation with someone else. So I do feel like I would do it all again, but I would also embrace the variety of the experience and just enjoy, being able to call myself an expert generalist instead of just an expert in one thing.
Right. That's wonderful. And I think there's a lot of people that go to architecture school, and just being in such a creative major, you probably have a lot of different hobbies and talents that you want to convey. So definitely living in the moment and kind of understanding that all this creativeness is open to you now, and just to dive right into it while you can. So thank you for saying that as well. And where can we find you on social media?
Well, I am a big proponent of LinkedIn, being a career coach. So you're welcome to reach out and connect on LinkedIn. The Out of Architecture website is a great place to start, outofarchitecture.com, as well as the Out of Architecture Instagram. And yeah, I think those are great places for us to connect.
Awesome. I'm definitely going to be doing that, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers here will be too. So thank you so much for having this conversation with us today. Again, thank you for everybody watching the Student's Perspective. I'm Jen. I just interviewed Jake Rudin, and tune in every Wednesday and give us a listen. Thank you so much.